Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to this presentation of the pros and cons for the state propositions in the November 2022 general election. The content we'll cover tonight is the same as what was presented in a previous session on October 9th, and a recording of this presentation will be made available on our website and our YouTube channel. My name is Frances Zhan. I'm currently the Secretary of the League of Women Voters, Southwest Santa Clara Valley, which covers the cities of Los Gatos, Saratoga, Monte Sereno, Campbell, and a small segment of West San Jose. The League of Women Voters has been empowering voters and defending democracy for over 100 years. The League has two distinct roles. It provides nonpartisan voter services and never endorses or opposes any political party or candidate. In certain instances, the League does advocate when we have studied an issue and have developed a position on it. Next slide. Today, we're engaged in voter service. We will be presenting nonpartisan information on the pros and cons of these 7 statewide propositions on the November 8th ballot. There may be some additional local measures depending on where you are. So when you receive your ballot, please make sure to check your ballot for any local measures. Next slide. Now I'd like to introduce our voter service team who will be presenting tonight, starting with Eleanor Yick, our Vice President in charge of voter service. She will present the pros and cons for propositions 1, 26, and 27. Then I will cover propositions 28 and 29. And followed by Aileen Kao, our membership director, will present propositions 30 and 31. Hello, Eleanor and Aileen.
Thank you, Frances. Good evening again, and welcome to this live presentation of the pros and cons on the 7 ballot measures that are on the California November state ballot. But before we begin, let me review a couple of reminders with you. Or Frances, did you want to go over this part?
Yes, I'll go ahead and do this. For this presentation, please remember to keep yourself muted and your video off during the presentation. And at the end, we'll have time for a short Q&A. If you have any questions, please type it into the chat. If your question is related to a specific proposition, please remember to start your question with the proposition number. Presenters will review the questions and will select some of them to answer. And now I'll turn it over to Eleanor to begin our presentation.
Thank you once again, Frances. As I said, we welcome you again to this pros and cons presentation. But before we begin to actually look at the propositions, we'd like to answer a question that is frequently asked by people. What are these state ballot measures and how do they even get on the ballot? If you look at this slide here, you'll see that California voters, unlike voters in many other states, have the opportunity to not only vote on candidates, but they're often asked to vote on proposed new laws called propositions or ballot measures. This process has been in place for many, many years and gives Californians direct voice into their government. Now, what are state propositions? They're actually ballot measures that propose new laws for the whole state. How do they get onto the ballot? One of 2 ways. They can be put on there by the state legislature with either a majority vote or a 2/3 vote if the law would amend the state constitution or propose a new tax or bond. And we do have one of these amendments on the propositions tonight. The second way it can be placed on the ballot is by citizens of the state who collect enough signatures signing on to an initiative about a particular measure. And if they meet the qualifying numbers and they're valid voters, then they're placed onto the state ballot. We have a number of those tonight. We also have a referendum as one of the propositions tonight. And what is a referendum? It's actually giving the voters in California another chance to vote on a particular law. The way a referendum comes about is that within 90 days of the passage of a law, an entity or a group of citizens or a citizen could draft a petition, an initiative, gather the required number of signatures that are then verified by the state. And if they meet that number, then that referendum goes on to the ballot, which you will hear about tonight. And lastly, measures can go on your ballot by local measures. Your city, town, or district or county can choose to put a local measure on the ballot. So now let's move on. Next slide, please. Again, what are pros and cons? They're unbiased, they're nonpartisan explanation of the state ballot measures. We hope after the presentation, you're aware of the issues or the question, the context, meaning the background, some arguments that have been put forth for and against, and we also give you information about campaign finance. Next slide. A little bit more about those pros and cons. What I want you to note here is that the arguments that have been submitted by supporters and opponents come from many sources and are not limited to those just in your official voter information guide. And most importantly, the League does not judge the merits of the arguments or even guarantee their validity. These arguments are submitted by people who are supporters of something or opponents, and they're trying to convince you to vote the way they would like you to vote. So you need to use your judgment in assessing the arguments. Next slide, please. So now we will begin with Proposition 1. And it's one of those ones that was put on the ballot by the state legislature because it amends the state constitution to include a right to reproductive freedom. And what is the actual question that's going to be asked? And as we go through these propositions, pay attention to some particular words because they're very important in the proposition. For example, in this one, the question says, should the California Constitution be amended to expressly guarantee the right to reproductive health care freedom, including the right to choose an abortion and to choose or refuse contraception? Next slide. So a general overview, the situation, abortion currently is protected by law in California, but it is not explicitly stated in the Constitution. It comes under privacy rights. This amendment wants to amend the Constitution by adding some very specific language. Fiscal impacts, if this were to pass, currently there would be no fiscal impact on the state budget. Next slide, please. Okay, the overview again on the proposition. It will expressly prohibit the state from denying or interfering with an individual's reproductive freedom. And it further enshrines or enforces the constitutional right to privacy and the right to equal protection under the law. Now some information about background. As we probably all know, with the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision in 1973, the US Constitution recognized a protected right to choose an abortion. And that decision was upheld until earlier this year when it was overturned. With the Dobbs versus Jackson decision this year, that federal protection was eliminated. And once that happened, people have now begun to fear that other rights might be vulnerable. For example, the right to same-sex marriage or the right to use or not use contraceptives. So they're concerned that the Supreme Court overturned this right. What else could happen? And currently, California law recognizes the right to privacy. This amendment would further protect the right to privacy about reproductive decisions specifically. Next slide, please. Now, what do the supporters say? The supporters say our state constitution should protect reproductive rights so that they will not be at risk in the future. Next slide. And let's add on to these arguments. But again, I want to emphasize with you, you see after the word supporters, the little asterisk. And if you go down here, it says, these are arguments submitted by advocacy groups. Their accuracy and validity cannot be guaranteed by us. So again, the supporters, they say California can no longer count on the federal government to protect rights. So we need to protect reproductive rights. Reproductive medical decisions should be made between a patient and their medical provider only. And when you have an amendment, only future state voters could make a change to this amendment. Who are some supporters of Proposition 1? California Medical Association, Planned Parenthood, California Nurses Association, American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and so on. Next page, please. What do the opponents say? The opponents say Proposition 1 is an extreme, expensive, and pointless waste of tax money that will allow abortion at any time. Next slide. What do the opponents say? They say women already have the right to choose in California. We don't need to change the Constitution. And very importantly to them, we need to think about the rights of the unborn fetus, especially after viability. Who are some opponents of Proposition 1? The Republican Party of California, the California Catholic Conference, Democrats for Life of America, International Faith-Based Coalition, California Alliance of Pregnancy Care, and so on. Next slide, please. Now let's look at some campaign finance. Top donors supporting Proposition 1. Federated Indians of Grattan Rancheria, $5 million. Newsom for California, PAC, $876,000. California Medical Association and its affiliated entities, $850,000. 500,000, 500,000, for a total of $9.7 million has been donated to support passage of this constitutional amendment. Donors opposing Proposition 1, you'll notice here we don't have any listed. Why? Not because there haven't been any donors, because there have been donors, but as of 10/5/22, no committee had raised enough money to reach the reporting threshold to be listed here. Only those committees that have raised $1 million or more and have at least one donor of $10,000 or more are listed. Next slide, please. Again, if this constitutional amendment is to pass, what would the fiscal impact be on the budget? If passed, currently, right now, it would have no direct fiscal effect. But it has been stated that if a court in the future finds that this proposition expands reproductive rights beyond the existing law, there could potentially be some fiscal effects, but it's unknown at this time. Next slide. So bottom line, what does your vote mean? Your yes vote means that the California Constitution would be amended, changed, to expressly include existing rights to reproductive freedom, to choose whether or not to have an abortion, and to use contraceptives. A no vote means the California Constitution would not be amended to expressly include existing rights to reproductive freedom. These rights, however, would continue to exist under other state laws. Next proposition, please. Next, we are going to move on to the first of two propositions related to sports betting. And you might be asking yourself, why do we have two propositions about sports betting? And in fact, we had a proposition in 2020 about sports betting. The reason is that prior to 2018, sports betting used to be banned under the US federal Constitution. But in 2018, the Supreme Court changed that decision and found the prohibition against sports betting illegal. So they said now it can be legal in various states. And since that time, of course, many states have been trying to pass laws to implement sports betting in various ways. So this proposition allows, very importantly, in-person roulette, dice games, and sports wagering on tribal lands. The question itself is, should California legalize in-person sports betting, roulette, and dice games at tribal casinos? Next slide, please. What is the situation? Basically, right now, sports betting, roulette, and dice games are illegal in California and illegal in tribal casinos in the state. This proposal wants to legalize sports betting, fiscal effects, it could raise tens of millions of dollars, but it could also cost lots of money to regulate these new laws. Next slide. Again, what would this proposition do? The overview, again, it legalizes in-person sports betting at American Indian casinos and 4 racetracks. It would allow in-person sports betting offered to people 21 or older at tribal casinos and or at racetracks. It would legalize roulette and dice games. It would also create new enforcement laws. And it does prohibit betting on high school sports or events with California college teams. Next slide. Some more background. As I mentioned before, in 2018, the US Supreme Court found that the ban on sports betting was illegal. So now it can be implemented in the various states. But California, since that time and prior to, limited gambling in California. It banned sports betting, roulette, and games with dice, although California law has allowed the California lottery, card rooms to operate 82 and 32 counties. It has allowed betting on horse races at 4 private tracks and 29 fairs. And it has allowed betting at American Indian casino slot machines and card games, 66 casinos in 28 counties. Now, Californians currently place bets on sports events, but with bookies or offshore companies. Many play in fantasy leagues. The American Indian casinos do pay fees to the state and localities, and casino profits could benefit local communities. In fact, they do, and they do provide jobs. Next slide. Supporters say taxing sports betting would increase the state's revenue and allow California's tribes to provide vital services like healthcare, housing, infrastructure, and education to tribal members. Next slide. Supporters say this aids American Indian self-sufficiency and community programs, brings in money for the state, adds more jobs, provides the strongest age verification safeguards, and it strengthens enforcement of those. Now, who are the supporters of Proposition 26? 31 California Indian tribes, 19 city and county Democratic Central Committees, American Indian and Chamber of Commerce, our own Lieutenant Governor, and our state treasurer. Next slide. Opponents. Go back one slide, please. Opponents say gambling is addictive. Legalizing more types of gambling is bad for public health and safety. Next slide. The opponents continue. This will lead to more gambling addiction. It possibly puts existing card rooms in lower income communities out of business because now the casinos could do some of it. It expands horse racing that is often harmful to horses, and it creates non-union jobs with few benefits and little job security. And the major opponents of Proposition 26, Republican Party of California, Election Entertainment Group, Hawaiian Gardens Casino, Hollywood Park Casino, United Ventures, and so on. Next slide, please. Campaign finance. I do want to point out this rather unique committee here with its name. The name of the committee is Yes on 26, No on 27. And 10 California Indian tribes are included here. So when we look at the top donors supporting the passage of Prop 26, we see the Federated Indians of Grattan Rancheria, $31 million. The Pechanga Band of Luceno Mission Indians, $27 million. This next Indian tribe, Yocha Dehe Winton Nation, $22 million. The next one, $11 million. Last one here listed $11 million for a total of $122 million has been raised or donated in support of passing this proposition. Now let's look at the top donors opposing Proposition 26. Hawaiian Gardens Casino, $10 million. California Commerce Club, $10 million. Park West Casinos, $4 million. United Ventures, $4 million. Bicycle Hotel and Casino, $2 million, for a total of $43.6 million has been raised or donated to oppose this proposition. Now, I do want to point out that this data has been obtained from the California Fair Political Practices Commission, and it was collected as of October 5th. We encourage you to go back and check this out on Voter's Edge, and those numbers may have changed. But you can see the incredible amount of money that has been donated towards this proposition. Next slide, please. Fiscal impact. If this were to pass, it's uncertain, but it's estimated there could be tens of millions of dollars annually from racetrack and tribal casino sports betting payments and gambling. Some of that money would go towards an education commitment, 70% to the general fund, 15% to gambling enforcement, and 15% to problem gaming and mental health. But there would be increased state costs to regulate in-person sports betting, possibly reaching the low 10 millions of dollars. But indeed, some of that increased cost would come out of the increased revenues. Let's go ahead, please. So what does your yes vote mean? Your yes vote means that sports betting would be legal in California. 4 racetracks could offer in-person sports betting. Tribal casinos could offer in-person sports betting, including roulette and games played with dice, if permitted by individual tribal gambling agreements with the state. Each tribe that is involved that has a casino, they have to negotiate an agreement with the state on how they will conduct these activities and how the revenue generated will be used. A no vote means that sports betting would continue to be illegal in California. Tribal casinos would continue to be unable to offer roulette and games played with dice. So that's Proposition 26. Now let's move on to Proposition 27, which is also about sports betting. The difference here being allows online and mobile sports wagering outside of tribal lands. So the question is, should California legalize online sports betting outside of Indian lands? Next slide. What is the situation? Currently, in California and on Indian lands, online sports betting is illegal. This proposition wants to legalize online and mobile sports betting in California for individuals 21 and over outside of Indian lands. Could raise in the mid-hundreds of millions of dollars each year. New regulations could also cost tens of millions of dollars. Next slide. So the overview, it legalizes or would legalize mobile and online sports betting outside of tribal lands. Licensed tribes or gambling companies could offer online sports betting. Some of the revenue would go towards homelessness, mental health, and tribal development. They would pay the state a share of the betting profits. They always have to because it needs to be drawn up in a contract or a compact. But a new unit would need to be set up to regulate online betting and, most importantly, enforce the age requirement. Next slide. Background. Again, the U.S. Supreme Court ended the prohibition on sports betting in 2018. 20 states have since legalized sports betting. I just read someplace that actually 35 states have now legalized it. California is using the initiative system to create laws. Again, it was put on the ballot by an initiative that garnered enough signatures to go on the ballot to be voted by the citizens of California. Currently, it is legal in California to play the lottery, bet on a horse, wager on card games, gamble, and tribal casinos. But betting on sports events is currently illegal in California. Next slide. Supporters say Proposition 27 will provide hundreds of millions of dollars to support programs that alleviate homelessness, mental health, and addiction in California. Next slide. Supporters again say this will provide millions to state revenue to support programs. They say sports gambling is already happening. Let's make it legal. And it will give some tribes more profits than others. The supporters, Californians for Solution to Homelessness and Mental Health, the mayors of Fresno, Long Beach, Oakland, and Sacramento, 3 major American Indian tribes, and Major League Baseball. Next slide. Opponents say Prop 27 is a deceptive measure promoted by out-of-state companies to legalize online and mobile sports gambling in California. Next slide. Opponents further state, this initiative was sponsored by out-of-state online gambling entities that will make millions of dollars. Money will leave the state, very high fees and hard for smaller entities to take part, and very difficult to enforce the 21-year-old age limit. And it's not the solution to homelessness. Who are the opponents of Proposition 27? Democratic Party of California, Republican Party of California, the heads of the Democratic and Republican branches of the state legislature, over 50 California Indian tribes, the California Teachers Association, Communication Workers of America. Next slide. Campaign finance. Top donors supporting passage of Proposition 27, Better Interactive, which is FanDuel Sportsbook, donated $35 million. Crown Gaming, $34 million. BetMGM, $25 million. Penn Interactive Ventures, $25 million. Bally's Interactive, $12.5 million. $169 million has been donated, raised to support passage of Proposition 27. Now let's look at the top donors opposing 27. Again, we see this different committee that has its name, yes on 26, no on 27, which is composed of 10 California Indian tribes. And as a total, they've donated $122.5 million. Breaking down, we say the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, $78 million. Rincon Band of Luisan Mission Indians, $10 million. The Pala Casino Resort Spa, $3 million. And the Wilton Rancheria, $50,000, for a total of $213.7 million as of October 5th. We do encourage our listeners to go back in and check on the California Fair Political Practices Commission and Voters Edge and check these totals, as they will probably be changing during the month of October. Very large sum of money has been raised both in support and opposing. Next slide. What would the fiscal impact if this passed? If it passed, you'll have increased state revenues, possibly in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But likely not more than $500 million annually from sports betting payments and penalties. But there will be increased states' costs to regulate this online betting, possibly reaching the mid of tens of millions of dollars. Of course, some of this would be offset by the increased revenue. Next slide. So bottom line, what does your vote mean? It means that yes means licensed tribes or gambling companies could offer online sports betting over the internet and mobile devices to people 21 years of age and older on non-tribal lands in California. A new state unit would be created to regulate online sports betting. A no vote means that sports betting would continue to be illegal in California. No changes would be made to the way the state gambling laws are enforced. Next slide. And lastly, people have asked, well, what happens if both propositions pass, 26 and 27? They're both about legalizing sports betting. So if they both passed, it's possible that both could take effect. But if a court finds that parts of the propositions, part of 26 and 27, are in conflict, then the one that received the most yes votes will become the law. Thank you. And now I'll pass this back to Frances, who will continue with our review.
Thank you, Eleanor. Now let's look at Proposition 28. Prop 28 would provide additional funding for arts and music education in public schools. The question here is, should California set aside some of its revenue to fund arts and music education in K-12 public schools? Next slide, please. The current situation is the state has no annual source of extra public school funding for arts and music education. And we'll take a closer look at Prop 28 and its possible fiscal effects. Next slide, please. Here's some more information about this proposition. If passed, Prop 28 would require that the state provide funding specifically for arts and music education in K-12 public schools. This funding would be in addition to the funding already guaranteed to schools by Prop 98, which was passed in 1988, and would be at least 1% of the funding received by schools from Prop 98. Distribution of the funding would be based on enrollment. 70% would be allocated to schools based on numbers of students, and 30% would be allocated based on proportion of students from low-income households. A school's principal would be responsible for planning how the funding would be spent, and schools with more than 500 students will be required to spend at least 80% of funding to employ staff. Every year, local school boards will be required to certify that their schools spent the funding provided by Prop 28 on music and arts education and report publicly how this money was used. Next. Now, a little more background. Public schools in California serve about 6 million K-12 students. Districts are under the jurisdiction of local governing boards. Roughly 60% of California public school students are from low-income families. Prop 98, passed in 1988, changed the California Constitution to require a minimum percentage of the state budget on K-12 education. There is currently no guaranteed source of annual funding specifically for arts and music education in K-12 public schools. There are some state-funded enrichment programs, which may contain arts and music education. State law requires schools to provide arts and music instruction to all students in grades 1 through 6, and students in grades 7 and 8 must be offered art and music as an elective. High school students currently must complete 1 year of arts or music to graduate. Next slide. Now let's take a look at the pros and cons. So those supporting Prop 28 say that studies have shown that arts and music education improve a student's personal life and academic potential. Next slide. Supporters also say that Prop 28 would increase funding for educational programs without raising taxes. They add that currently, only about 1 in 5 public schools in California has a dedicated teacher for arts or music programs, compared to other states such as New York, where over 75% of schools have designated arts or music instructors. As you can see here, the main supporters of this proposition are Californians for Arts and Music in Public Schools, California Teachers Association, and California State PTA. Next slide. So opponents say that Prop 28 will limit the state funds available for other spending. Next. They also say this is not the way to create a budget for schools. Requiring a set amount for music and arts education reduces the ability of the state to fund other programs that are equally important. Also, if enrollment declines, this would reduce flexibility to shift funding from schools to other programs. There are currently no arguments officially submitted to the state opposing Prop 28. But we found that LA Times and the East Bay Times have written editorials with opposing opinions. They say that this is not a good time to add a requirement for use of general funds. Next, let's take a look at the campaign finance for Prop 28. The financial support for this proposition has mainly come from Austin Butner with $4 million, Fender musical instruments for $1 million, California Teachers Association, $1 million, and Balmer Giving, Monica Rosenthal, each with $1 million, with a total of $9.1 million on the supporting side. Now, on the opposing side, as of October 5th, no committee have raised enough money to reach the reporting threshold. Again, only those committees that have raised $1 million or more and have at least one contributor of $10,000 or more will be listed here. Okay, next. If Prop 28 passes, the fiscal impact on state and local governments is likely to be a spending of $800 million to $1 billion each year. This is less than 1/2 of 1% of the state's general fund. Next slide. So bottom line, what does your vote mean? Voting yes on Prop 28 means the state would provide additional funding specifically for arts education in public schools. And voting no would mean funding for arts education in public schools would continue to depend on state and local budget decisions. And now let's move on to Prop 29. Prop 29 will require on-site licensed medical professional at kidney dialysis clinics and establish other state requirements. The question it poses is, should outpatient dialysis clinics be required to have a physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant on site at all hours when patients are being treated? Next slide. Currently, dialysis is usually provided by licensed dialysis clinics, and a patient's personal doctor must visit them once a month during treatment. Now let's take a closer look at the proposal and its fiscal effects. So here's some details about Prop 29. First, if passed, this proposition would require at least one licensed physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant on site during treatment at kidney dialysis clinics. The California Department of Public Health can make an exception when there is a shortage of these practitioners, in which case telehealth must be utilized. Second, Prop 29 requires that clinics provide patients with a list of all physicians who have ownership interest in the clinic of 5% or more and report to the state every 3 months anyone having 5% or more interest in the clinic. If they fail to do so, they could be fined $100,000. The proposition also requires reporting of dialysis-related infections to a state agency and mandates state approval for clinics to close or reduce services. And lastly, clinics would have to offer the same level of care to all patients regardless of whether the treatment is paid for by private insurance or a government-funded program such as Medi-Cal or Medicare. Next slide. Now some more background on Prop 29. About 80,000 Californians receive hemodialysis every month in one of 650 dialysis centers in California. This treatment is usually done 3 times a week, and each treatment lasts about 4 hours. Most clinics are open 6 days a week. Nearly 3/4 of these clinics are owned by 2 for-profit corporations, DaVita Inc. and Fresenius Medical Care. The California Department of Public Health is responsible for licensing chronic dialysis clinics to operate in California using federal regulations as the basis for licensing. Currently, all chronic dialysis clinics must be licensed to receive Medicare and Medi-Cal payments. One of the current federal requirements is that a board-certified medical doctor be affiliated with each chronic dialysis center and be responsible for quality of care, staff training, and clinic practices. Federal law also requires reports to the National Healthcare Safety Network on kidney-related infections. So this is the third proposition that has been supported by SEIU, United Healthcare Workers West, which is a labor union for healthcare workers. SEIU says that workers at dialysis clinics have been attempting to unionize since 2016 and have faced some retaliation by employers. In February 2017, SEIU began efforts to pass a 2018 proposition, Prop 8, which would have put a 15% ceiling on the profits of private operators. The dialysis industry defeated that measure with a record $111 million campaign. Then in 2020, SEIU put Prop 23 on the ballot, which would have required a physician to be on site during dialysis treatment. That proposition was defeated with about $121 million spent on the campaign, with 85% of that by the opponents, who were mainly the dialysis corporations. So this year, Prop 29 has again been introduced by SEIU, who continue to say they want to improve safety for patients and reduce stress on workers. Also, they want to make sure that patients and the public get more information about ownership of clinics, as increasing numbers of doctors are collaborating on joint venture ownerships, which may or may not create conflict of interest situations. Next slide. Those supporting Prop 29 believe that chronic dialysis clinics need to be better supervised and regulated. They say dialysis is a potentially dangerous procedure, and having a trained doctor, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant on site during patient treatment hours would assure more oversight. Next slide. Also, supporters feel that patients and the public should know who owns the clinics and who will profit from treatment there. Supporters want to make sure that no one is turned away due to source of payment for services, and that service for everyone is comparable. Supporters state that dialysis companies are making windfall profits of about 18%, and some of these profits should be spent on improving oversight and care. Leading the campaign in support of Prop 29, again, is SEIU United Healthcare Workers West and Californians for Kidney Dialysis Patient Protection. Next slide. So those opposing Prop 29 say that this proposition would take healthcare workers away from hospitals and emergency rooms, which may result in a shortage of doctors in other necessary areas of care. Next slide. Opponents also say this change could increase dialysis treatment costs by hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And as a result, they feel that nearly half of the clinics in the state might become financially unsustainable and be forced to close. They also feel that asking a doctor, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant be on site is unnecessary for patient safety. Currently, only 8 states have regulations mandating staffing ratios, and there's no evidence that these staffing requirements have improved care. They say that data gathered by Medicare, which pays for most dialysis care, show that California is actually doing better with lower infection rates than in states that have more defined staffing requirements in place. Nurses and other technicians are adequately trained to administer dialysis and respond to special needs. Opponents of Prop 29 include, again, the 2 largest dialysis businesses, DaVita Incorporated and Fresenius Medical Care. Opponents also include the Republican Party of California and other organizations listed here, such as the California Medical Association, California Physician Assistants, American Nurses Association of California, etc. Okay, next. Next slide, please. And now let's take a look at campaign finance. On the supporting side, as of October 5th, no committees have raised enough money to be listed here. Only those that have raised $1 million or more or have at least one contributor of $10,000 or more will be listed. And again, the main financial contributors of the opposition are the 2 largest dialysis businesses, DaVita and Fresenius. They have each contributed $52.7 million and $27.3 million to oppose Proposition 29. And there's a total of $86 million opposing Prop 29. Next slide. Now, the fiscal impact of Prop 29 on state and local government is uncertain. However, it is thought that if this proposition passes, clinic owners will most likely negotiate higher insurance payments to offset increased staffing costs. The budget impact on the state would likely be in the low tens of millions of dollars annually, so that the state would have to pay for increased dialysis treatment costs for Medi-Cal patients, as well as increased administrative responsibilities at the state level. Next. So bottom line, what does your vote mean? Voting yes on Prop 29 means chronic dialysis clinics would be required to have a physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant on site during all patient treatment hours and require clinics to disclose physicians' ownership interests. Voting no on Prop 29 would mean no changes will be made. Chronic dialysis clinics would not be required to have a physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant on site during all patient treatment hours. I hope this overview of Prop 28 and 29 has been helpful to you. Again, we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so feel free to type in any questions you may have in the chat. And now I'll turn it over to Aileen to present the rest of the propositions.
Thank you, Francis. Now let's take a look about Proposition 30. It provides funding for programs to reduce air pollution and prevent wildfires by increasing tax on personal income over 2 million. So the question in front of the voter is, should California create a new tax on any individual's income of more than 2 million per year? So next slide. Proposition 30 in a nutshell is captured here. The state collects taxes on income made in California. So in 2020, the state collected over 130 billion in income tax. So if the proposal will create a new tax on any individual's income of more than 2 million per year and use this money to increase electric car usage and manage wildfire better. The overall revenue increases of between 3.5 and 5 billion each year. And of course, the program manager will cost the state tens of millions to the low hundreds of millions of dollars. Next. So when we take a closer look of Proposition 30, we'll see that this proposition propose an increase in income tax rate by 1.75% on income over 2 million. And the rate will be 15.05% for each dollar above 2 million. This tax increase would end January 1st, 2043, if not sooner. At least 50% of the funds allocated for ZEVs and charging must benefit low-income and disadvantaged communities. This proposition requires CAL FIRE to hire and train more firefighters as a top priority. The pie chart here shows the allocation of funds, and 45% of the fund collected would help buy new ZEVs, and 35% will go into building more charging stations. 20% would go into wildfire response and prevention. Next. So some background here. As we know, California is experiencing severe drought with increasing wildfires and poor air quality. Most people think that drought is caused in large part by global warming, and gas-powered cars and wildfire smoke are the two largest sources of greenhouse gas in the state of California. Both also contribute to poor air quality. The state currently requires the state law currently requires California to reduce its greenhouse gas emission level to 40% below the 1990 level by 2030. State law also requires ride-sharing companies such as Lyft and Uber to have 90% of their drivers using zero-emission vehicles by 2030. Furthermore, a current plan was just issued by the governor on August 25th, indicating that by 2030, 100% all of the new vehicles sold must be ZEVs. The state recently committed 10 billion on ZEVs and 2 to 4 billion on wildfire response. The cost of wildfire suppression and the prevention are increasing because these fires are becoming more catastrophic. Next slide. So the supporter of Proposition 30 say, greenhouse gas emission, wildfires are our major environmental issues, and we need to take action now. Next. Plus, they also say that existing programs are insufficient to address these problems. So more funding are required. On this table, you'll see the supporters of Proposition 30, including Lyft Corporation, California Democratic Party, Natural Resource Defense Council, and so on. Next slide. So those opposing Proposition 30 say, if those issues are important, they should be paid with the state general fund, not a new taxes. Plus, they also say, next slide, that Proposition 30 is not a guarantee to make more ZEV affordable. And Proposition 30 will lock in monies for these special interests, and none will go to education. And California is already investing more than 50 billion on climate issues. So they further say Lyft is attempting to get taxpayer to help foot the bill. So opponents of Proposition 30s are listed here on this table, such as Java's Taxpayer Association, California Small Business Association, United Latinos Action, and so on. So next slide. So who are the top donors supporting Proposition 30? Who are the top donors opposing Proposition 30? So we'll see from these two tables. Lyft Corporation donated 45.2 million, and others. Top donors opposing, such as Catherine Dean, Mark Hansing, Michael Morris, and plus, I think Governor Newsom's PAC also is opposing Proposition 30. So together, you'll see so much money has been put into campaigning for this proposition. Next. Proposition 30 would generate ranging from 3.5 to 5 billion annually. And this revenue could increase over time. Next slide. So what does it mean when you vote yes and when you vote no? A yes vote would say taxpayer would pay an additional tax of 1.75% on personal income above 2 million annually. And the funds would be going to support ZEV programs and the wildfire response and prevention. And your no vote would mean no change would be made to taxes on personal income above 2 million annually. Next. I hope this helped you, and we will move on to Proposition 31. Proposition 31 is a referendum on 2020 law that would prohibit the retail sale of a certain flavored tobacco products. So the question in front of the voter is, should California ban the sale of flavored tobacco products? Next. Proposition in a nutshell is captured here. The state passed a new law in 2020 banning the sale of flavored tobacco products. This new law has not gone into effect. So the proposal banned the sale of flavored tobacco products by allowing the state's new law to go into effect. If passed, it could cost tens of millions to hundreds of millions in loss of tax revenue. And of course, the enforcement would cost hundreds of thousands to low millions. Next slide. And so if we take a closer look of Proposition 31, we will see that it is a referendum ask that a law that has already been passed and signed be approved again by the voters. And the voting yes on Proposition 30 would mean that you support SB 793. That's a new law being passed and approved in 2020 that prohibits the sale of certain flavor tobacco products. And voting no means that you want SB 793 be overturned and support the sale of a flavored tobacco product. So some background here. In August 2020, SB 793 was signed into law. And the banning would include some flavored juices, menthol cigarette, and other flavored product, excluding whole cane tobacco and the premium cigars. In 2009, federal law banned cigarettes with non-tobacco flavored except menthol. This year, FDA proposed banning menthol flavored cigarette and all non-tobacco flavored cigars. Actually, state and local governments can mandate stricter rules than the federal government. And as of now, about 1/3 of California live in the area that banning certain sales of flavored tobacco products. Next. So the supporter says nicotine is very addictive, and the flavored tobacco could cause a lifelong addiction. Next. Furthermore, flavored tobacco is actually a gateway to addiction among children. So right now in US, more than 2 million middle and high school students use e-cigarette because many of them are enjoying the flavor. So statistic data said 4 out of 5 young people who have used tobacco started with a flavored product. So the supporter of Proposition 30 include American Academy of Pediatrics, American Heart Association, American Cancer Society, Cancer Action Network, and so on. Next slide. But on the other side, the opponent says adults who choose to use a flavored tobacco product will no longer be able to have the choice on their product they like. Furthermore, they say, next slide, that SB 793 is unfair because it does not allow the sale of some flavored tobacco product. So the passage would hurt the small business, and it might drive the sale to underground market, and this would increase more crime. Of course, the state would lose tax revenues. So the opponents of Proposition 31 include California Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, California Taxpayer Protection Committee, Central Valley Business Federations, and so on. So next slide. Let's see who are supporting and who are opposing with their money in their mouth. Michael Bloomberg put 6.8 million. Kaiser Foundation Health Plan put 1.1 million, among others. So the total as of the reporting period of October 5th is about 8.7 million. The top donor opposing Proposition 31, of course, are the tobacco companies, R.J. Reynolds, Phyllis Morris, ITG Brands, and the total as of October 5th is about 23.2 million. Again, a lot of money putting into finance this proposition. Next slide. Proposition 31, banning the flavored tobacco, that decreases state tobacco tax revenue ranging from about tens of millions of dollars up to around 100 million annually. So the size of the loss could depending on whether the smoker would switch and continue to smoke a non-flavored product instead. Next slide. So what does it mean of your vote for yes or no? Your yes vote would mean SB 793 will be implemented. So in-person store and the vending machine could not sell most flavored tobacco or enhancers. On the other hand, SB 793, your no vote will not be implemented. And the in-person store and the vending machine could continue to sell those products. So next slide. That concludes this portion of a presentation of today's pros and cons. And we will next move on to see if